I command you to rise. I command that power to fall upon you right now. I command power. Emmanuel, your father is dead and left you in heavy debt.
Daniel stretched his hand toward the crowd one more time, and roars of people fell backward like waves, like grass bending under wind, ushers rushing to catch them before they hit the ground. Tongues no one could understand poured out of his mouth. Every phone in that building was recording, every eye was fixed on him. In that moment, nobody in that building doubted that Daniel Stephen was a true man of God, chosen, anointed, untouchable. But what the crowd screaming his name that night did not know, what none of them could have imagined, was the price behind every single miracle they were witnessing. They did not know that for every wave of power that swept through that building, somewhere, quietly, a life had already been paid for it. By the time this story ends, over 500 people connected to this church would be dead, and the man they called Papa, the man whose hand they were fighting to touch, would be the reason why. To understand how a man built something this powerful and how far he was willing to go to keep it, we have to go back to 1996, before the crowds, before the miracles, before anyone called him a prophet at all. Before we continue, if stories like this move you, do us a favor. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Hit that subscribe button, tap like, and share this with someone who needs to hear it, because this story is not just entertainment, it's a warning. Now, let's go back to where it all started. It was the year 1996, in a growing city in the eastern part of Nigeria, and the church was still in mourning. Bishop Andrew Whitfield, the founder and leader of Living Grace Cathedral, had died after a short illness, and the whole congregation was thrown into confusion. He had built the church from nothing, from a small gathering under a mango tree to one of the biggest churches in the state. Thousands of members called him Father. When he died, everyone wanted to know one thing: who would take his place? Among the senior pastors in the church was a man named Daniel Stephen. Daniel was known for two things. First, he had a strange and powerful gift. He could see visions that came true. He could pray for a sick person, and that person would stand up and walk again right there in front of everyone. People respected that gift, even the ones who did not particularly like him as a person. Second, Daniel was ambitious. Some people even called it hunger. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be first. He wanted to lead. When the bishop died, Daniel stood up in a leadership meeting and told the elders that he was the closest person to the late bishop, that the bishop had personally been preparing him to take over one day. Some of the younger pastors believed him and supported him openly. But the elders, the men and women who had built that church with Bishop Whitfield from the very beginning, did not trust him. They remembered how Daniel used to push himself forward at every opportunity, how he was always positioning himself close to the bishop whenever cameras were around, how he spoke about himself more than he spoke about God. When the vote was taken, 70% of the leadership rejected him. They chose someone else, an older, quieter pastor named Michael Bassi, a man known for his humility and his simple way of preaching. Daniel was destroyed. Not outwardly. Outwardly, he congratulated Pastor Michael with a smile and clapped along with everyone else. But inside, something changed in him that day. He felt cheated. He felt that these people did not deserve his gift, that the anointing on his life was too big to be kept under someone else's covering. 3 months later, Daniel Stephen walked out of Living Grace Cathedral. He did not leave quietly. He gathered the members who supported him, about 40 families, and told them that God had spoken to him, that it was time to build something new, something that would shake the whole nation. He named his new church the Blessed City International Ministries. The 40 families believed in him completely. Some of them had personally seen him pray for a dying relative and watched that relative recover. Others simply liked how he preached, how he made them feel special, chosen, close to God. It did not take long for them to organize everything. They pooled their money together and bought a modest sound system. They formed a small but talented praise and worship team led by a soft-spoken young woman named Grace Whitefield, no relation to the late bishop, just a coincidence of surname that some members later whispered about as a sign. They rented a small event hall in the city center and they began to prepare for their grand opening night, which they called the Night of Restoration. Flyers went up all over the city. Posters were pasted on walls, on bus stops, on the doors of shops in the market. Word spread through phone calls and church networks. And when the night finally came, the small hall was full. Every seat was taken, people stood at the back, and some peeped in through the windows. That night, everything was pure. Everything was normal. People sang, people prayed, people cried real tears of worship. Daniel preached a simple message about new beginnings, about restoration, about God doing something fresh. Nobody in that hall that night could have imagined what their prophet would eventually become. Nobody could have imagined the graves that would follow. For the first 2 years, the Blessed City International Ministries grew the way a normal, healthy church grows, slowly, honestly. Sunday services had between 70 and 100 people, counting the regular members and the visitors who came out of curiosity. There were fasting programs where the church would go without food for 3 days, praying together, encouraging one another. There were all-night prayer meetings that ended with everyone tired but joyful, walking home together under the streetlights, laughing about small things, talking about their lives. Daniel Stephen, during this period, behaved like a true shepherd. He visited members in the hospital, he sat with families who had lost loved ones, he counseled young couples before their weddings. Nobody spoke in unknown tongues that nobody could interpret, nobody screamed on the floor without reason. It was, by every measure, an ordinary growing church built by an ordinary gifted man. Among the members who joined during this period was a young man named Peter Adeyemi, a mechanic by trade, quiet and thoughtful, the kind of person who watched more than he spoke. Peter had joined the church because his mother, a widow, had been struggling with severe back pain that no hospital could explain, and Daniel had prayed for her one Sunday. 2 weeks later, the pain was gone. Peter never forgot that. He became one of the most loyal members of the church, eventually joining the ushering department and later becoming close friends with 3 other young men his age, Thomas Bright, James Coleman, and a serious young man called Samuel Grant. These 4 young men would later play the most important role in this whole story, but at this point, they were simply 4 friends who loved their church and trusted their prophet completely. Nobody could see what was coming. There was no sign, no warning, nothing to suggest that in a few years, this same church would become a place where people quietly died after almost every single service, and where the man at the pulpit would be responsible for all of it. But change was coming, and it would come wrapped in the language every struggling believer longs to hear, the language of breakthrough, healing, and power. It began with an announcement. One Sunday morning, Daniel stood before his congregation, now grown to around 200 members, and told them he was going to travel to visit his spiritual father, a man he described only as a deep man of God who carried a heavy anointing. He said that when he returned, the church would experience a fresh grace, a level of power they had never seen before. He asked the church to begin preparing for a special program, a healing and deliverance night. The church went into full preparation. Posters were printed and placed all over the city. Daniel paid for social media advertisements that reached far beyond the city, into other states, and eventually, people said, into other countries. Radio jingles played every morning. The name of the Blessed City International Ministries was suddenly everywhere. Before that night came, Daniel made a quiet journey that no member of his church knew about. He traveled alone into a rural area outside the city, walking a narrow path through thick forest until he reached a small thatched hut, lit only by firelight. Inside sat an old man wrapped in dark cloth, his face barely visible through the smoke of a burning clay pot. Daniel knelt before him. What was said in that hut, nobody in the church would ever know. Not yet. But when Daniel came out of that forest, something in him had changed. The night of the program came. The hall, now a larger rented facility because the church had outgrown its first building, was completely full. People stood outside, unable to get in. Cars lined the streets for almost a kilometer. The praise and worship team, led by Grace Whitefield, opened the night with songs that lifted the whole crowd into an emotional, expectant mood. People prayed, people cried, people felt in that moment that something real and holy was about to happen. Then Daniel Stephen walked in. The crowd erupted. People screamed his name. Some stretched their hands toward him, calling out, "Papa, Papa," as if reaching for him alone could heal them. The security team pushed through the crowd, shouting, "Make way for the prophet! Move, move, move!" Visitors who had come only out of curiosity found themselves swept up in the excitement, believing before they even understood what they were believing in. Daniel took the microphone. He began to declare things over the congregation, and as he stretched his hand toward the crowd, people began to fall to the ground, one after the other, like dominoes. For the first time since starting his own church, he began to speak in tongues, a language nobody recognized, flowing and unbroken. People wept. People screamed. He called out sicknesses by name, commanded them to leave people's bodies. He told strangers things about their past that only they could have known. He recited phone numbers of people standing far back in the crowd, numbers he had no natural way of knowing. By the time the night ended, nobody in that building doubted him anymore. Within a month, the hall could no longer contain the crowd that came every single Sunday. News of the miracles spread across the country. Then beyond it, the Blessed City International Ministries moved into a massive new auditorium, one that could hold thousands. New branches opened in other cities. New leaders were appointed to manage the growing empire. And quietly, without anyone truly noticing at first, people began to die. At first, it looked like coincidence. A member here, a member there, an elderly usher who collapsed after a Sunday service and never woke up, a young choir member who complained of chest pain during rehearsal and was dead before the ambulance arrived, a church leader who simply did not wake up one Monday morning after attending a midweek service the night before. In a church of a few hundred people, 1 or 2 deaths a year would have raised eyebrows. But the Blessed City International Ministries was no longer a church of a few hundred. It had thousands of members spread across several branches. Death, sadly, is something that happens to large populations of people, especially in a country where healthcare is not always reliable. So when a member died, people mourned, held a befitting funeral service, spoke of the person being called home by God, and moved on. Nobody was counting. Nobody had reason to count. Except that, quietly, the numbers were becoming strange. It was not just ordinary members dying. It was leaders, ushers, choir members, prayer warriors, people who were active, healthy, present in church every single week, the very people who walked closest to the prophet himself. There was also the matter of the offering bowl. At some point during the church's rapid growth, a new rule appeared. Offerings were no longer to be dropped into the regular collection baskets that had been used since the church's founding. Instead, a large, ornately carved wooden bowl was placed at the front of the altar, and members were instructed, gently but firmly, to bring their offerings forward and drop them into that particular bowl. Nobody could remember exactly when the bowl appeared. Nobody on the finance committee remembered purchasing it. When one of the newer administrators asked about it during a staff meeting, she was simply told that Papa brought it back from one of his spiritual journeys, and the conversation moved on. Nobody pressed further. When you are surrounded by miracles, by growth, by testimonies pouring in from every corner of the country, you do not stop to ask uncomfortable questions about a bowl. Strange things multiplied. During prayer sessions, Daniel would sometimes begin to speak in tongues in the middle of praying for a single individual, his voice changing, his eyes rolling back, his body shaking in a way that unsettled even the ushers standing closest to him, though they quickly learned to interpret it as the anointing rather than anything to worry about. Every service brought a new miracle. Every month brought a new rule. New rules about how members should dress, how they should sit, who was allowed to approach the altar, and who was not. And then Daniel Stephen made another trip to see his so-called spiritual father. When he returned, his power, as the members described it, had increased again, and so had the deaths.
Peter Adeyemi was no longer the young mechanic who had joined the church because his mother's back pain disappeared. He was now a respected member of the ushering department, trusted enough to work close to the altar during major services. And it was from that position, close to the front, that Peter began to notice a pattern that most members, distracted by the size and the excitement of the church, had missed entirely. Someone died almost every single Sunday, sometimes during the week too, and it was always someone active, someone close to the ministry. Peter mentioned it quietly to his three friends, Thomas Bright, James Coleman, and Samuel Grant, during one of their usual evening conversations after a Wednesday service. At first, they laughed it off. "It's just how it is," Thomas said. "The church is big now. Big churches lose members. It's normal." But Samuel, the most serious of the four, was not convinced. He began, quietly, to keep track. He wrote names in a small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. Names of people who had died, the dates, and what they were doing shortly before they died. Within a few months, the notebook had over 30 names. The four friends decided, without making any public announcement, to start their own small prayer group. They did not accuse anyone of anything. They simply told each other that the church needed covering, that something did not feel right, and that they should pray about it privately. They began meeting on Saturday evenings before service, praying quietly, sometimes fasting together, asking God to reveal whatever needed to be revealed and to protect the church from whatever was attacking it. They did not announce this group publicly, but in a church that size, nothing stays completely hidden. Word reached Daniel Stephen that 4 young men had started an unofficial prayer group, meeting without his permission, praying specifically against what they called the spirit of death. He called Peter, the most senior of the 4, into his office. He was calm, even friendly when he spoke. He told Peter that he appreciated their zeal, but that unofficial groups could bring confusion and division into the church. He asked Peter to stop the meetings, framing it as a matter of order, of proper church structure. Peter, respectful and still deeply loyal to the man who healed his mother years before, agreed to consider it. But that night, when Peter told the other 3 what had happened, something shifted in all of them. Why would the leader of a church object to a group of young men simply praying? What was there to hide from a prayer meeting? Samuel, flipping through his notebook of names, looked up at his friends and said the words that none of them would forget. "We didn't tell him what we were praying against. How did he know to be afraid of it?" They did not stop. They only became quieter and far more determined.
The following Sunday, Daniel Stevens stood at the pulpit and preached a message on order and submission in the house of God. Halfway through the sermon, his tone shifted. He looked directly toward the section of the auditorium where the ushers usually sat, and his voice grew sharp. "I have noticed something happening in this church," he said, gripping the sides of the pulpit. "Groups forming without my knowledge, meetings happening without my covering. Let me say this clearly. I am the leader of this church, and I know how this house must operate. Whatever you are doing outside of what I have sanctioned, I command you in the name of the Lord to stop it." He did not call out Peter, Thomas, James, or Samuel by name. He did not need to. Everyone who knew about the small Saturday prayer group understood exactly who he was speaking to. And the 4 young men, seated in different parts of the auditorium that day, felt every eye that turned toward them, even briefly, even without meaning to. After the service, several members approached Peter privately, asking what he had done to upset Papa. Peter said nothing beyond a polite smile, but inside, he understood something clearly now. They had touched something real. A leader confident in his own righteousness does not fear a group of young men praying quietly on a Saturday evening. Only a man hiding something reacts that way. The 4 friends met again that same night, and this time there was no more debate about whether to stop. They agreed to keep meeting, but even more privately than before, no longer calling it a group when speaking to other members, simply 4 friends who happened to gather. They increased their fasting. They began praying specifically, boldly, against whatever spirit was moving through the church, collecting lives every week. And on Sundays, quietly, without drawing attention, they positioned themselves near the front and prayed under their breath throughout the entire service, watching, waiting, refusing to be distracted by the noise and the excitement that swallowed everyone else in the building.
Months passed this way. The church continued growing. The deaths continued too. Though the 4 friends now understood something the rest of the congregation did not. This was not spiritual warfare from an outside enemy. Whatever or whoever was killing members of the Blessed City International Ministries was operating from the inside, from somewhere very close to the altar itself. They did not yet know how right they were. They did not yet know that the answer had been standing at the pulpit, holding a Bible in one hand every single Sunday. It was a Sunday, like every other Sunday, except that it was not. The auditorium was full, as always. The praise and worship team, still led by Grace Whitefield, opened the service with songs that lifted the whole congregation into worship. Daniel Stephen walked in to the usual roar of the crowd, hands stretched toward him, voices calling him Papa, Papa, as security guided him through the aisle. He preached briefly, then moved into what had become the signature part of every service, the declarations, the stretching of hands, the moment when the whole congregation waited to feel the wave of power that always, always came. He raised his hand toward the front row. Nothing happened. For a second, the congregation assumed it was simply a delay, a pause for effect. Daniel himself seemed to think the same thing. He tried again, stretching his hand further, his voice rising as he called out declarations. Still nothing. No one fell, no wave passed through the crowd. His voice, usually thunderous, suddenly sounded thin, almost desperate. It was at that exact moment that something moved behind him on the altar. A long, dark shape slid silently across the carpet, close enough to touch the hem of his robe, though he never once turned to see it. Only the cameras positioned at the back of the hall captured the shadow of it, something that would be studied and argued over for months after that night. He tried to speak, to say something, anything, to cover the failure the way he had covered every uncomfortable moment for the past several years, with more shouting, more fire, more declarations. But no sound came from his mouth. His lips moved. His eyes were wide, alert, clearly conscious, but his voice was gone, as though an invisible hand had reached into his throat and closed around it.
He staggered backward and collapsed onto the platform. The auditorium erupted into chaos. Security men rushed forward, shouting his name, trying to lift him, asking if he was okay, if he could hear them. He could not answer. He lay there, eyes open, breathing, alive, but utterly unable to speak, unable to move properly, as though every part of him, except his mind, had been switched off by something no doctor could name. And in that exact moment, on the front rows near the altar, Peter, Thomas, James, and Samuel began to pray, loudly this time, no longer hiding it. Their voices rose above the panic, commanding, bold, fearless. And as they prayed, several of the senior leaders seated in the front rows, the very leaders closest to the prophet, began to collapse as well. Some screaming, some staring wide-eyed at things no one else in the room could see. From beneath the altar, in front of hundreds of shocked witnesses, a snake emerged and slid across the platform in full view of the terrified crowd before disappearing behind the curtains. An ambulance was called. As paramedics lifted Daniel Stephen onto a stretcher, the only words he managed to force out with tremendous effort were, "Take me back to the church." At the hospital, doctors examined him and found nothing physically wrong. No stroke, no heart failure, no explanation for a healthy man suddenly losing the ability to speak or move freely. When he repeated over and over in broken whispers that he needed to go back to the church, his family eventually agreed, believing perhaps it was some spiritual matter beyond medical understanding. He was brought back to the auditorium, where members had refused to leave, gathering in worried clusters, whispering, praying, some crying, all waiting for answers. Peter, Thomas, James, and Samuel stood together near the front, watching closely as Daniel was carried back onto the platform and laid on a chair. Something in him seemed to be fighting itself. His body shook, his face contorted, as though two forces were wrestling for control of his own mouth. And then finally, words began to come, slow at first, then faster, as though once the dam broke, everything behind it came rushing out at once. He told them everything.
He told them about the man he called his spiritual father, who was not a man of God at all, but a powerful witch doctor in a remote village, a man who had promised him power beyond anything he could imagine, on one condition: that Daniel would bring him lives. Not animals, not symbolic offerings, human lives, real people, church members who trusted him completely, who came to his altar seeking healing and left instead as sacrifices he never told them they were making. He confessed that the strange offering bowl had been given to him by this witch doctor and that it was never truly an offering bowl at all. He confessed that every trip to his spiritual father had come with a price, and that price had always been paid in the deaths that followed. He wept as he spoke, though many in the congregation would later say his tears meant nothing, that a man who had knowingly sent hundreds of people to their deaths for personal power had no right to cry about the consequences. By the time he finished speaking, the auditorium was no longer a place of worship. It was a place of horror. Some members screamed, some fainted where they stood, others simply sat frozen, staring at the man they had called Papa, the man whose hand they had stretched toward, believing it carried the touch of God. People began shouting, demanding answers, demanding their tithes and offerings back, demanding to know the names of those who had died, demanding justice for years of deception dressed up as ministry. Before the chaos could organize itself into anything, before police could properly be called, before the full weight of what he had done could be measured against him in any court of law, Daniel Stephen's body gave one final shudder on that platform, and he died right there in front of the very people he had betrayed. In the weeks that followed, the country could talk of nothing else.
Journalists descended on the city. Investigators tried to piece together records, financial documents, membership numbers, and hospital reports, attempting to understand the true scale of what had happened over the years. Samuel's small notebook, the one he had kept quietly for so long, became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. A record of names that families had spent years assuming were simply victims of unfortunate, unrelated tragedies. The Blessed City International Ministries shut its doors permanently. The massive auditorium that once overflowed with thousands of worshippers stood empty, its gates locked, its name eventually painted over. The story is told now as a warning, not a horror story to be enjoyed, but a lesson to be carried. It teaches that gifts are not the same as godliness. A man can heal a sick woman's back and still be capable of unthinkable evil years later. It teaches that growth is not always proof of blessing. Sometimes the fastest growing things are the ones rotting quietest at the root. And it teaches that 4 young men, unwilling to stay silent simply because a powerful man told them to, were enough to bring the whole deception crashing down, even without weapons, without wealth, and without any authority except quiet prayer and the refusal to look away. Thank you so much for watching to the very end. May God protect you in whichever church you attend. Pray for the Holy Spirit to expose every evil operating silently in the church.